people to go underground, to deny who are denied their livelihood, whether it's in Hollywood and many other places. And we're seeing that with respect to Chinese American scientists. Dr. David Ho, who was one of the creators and inventors, discoverers of a lot of the treatments against AIDS, at a conference in Silicon Valley a few months ago, was talking about how, how African Americans in the Black community have this phrase, driving while Black. Well, now among Asian scientists and Chinese researchers, it's researching while Chinese. So many colleges and universities, corporations are loath to promote, hire, or give in any type of prominent position a Chinese scientist. So I really fear that this pandemic is giving rise an excuse to go after Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, and using that as a tool to really affect Asian Americans. I mean, yes, America has very legitimate concerns about the trade, the economic, the human rights policies of China. China needs to really account for when did the virus occur, how did it occur, what are the true numbers in terms of deaths or the people who were infected. But focusing on China and Asian Americans is to deflect the negligence and the mishandling of the coronavirus response by the Trump administration. I mean, so many other countries got the same warnings as the United States did in early January, mid-January. And yet our administration just went and played golf, said, no, it's no big deal, had this head in the sand approach for several months, which exacerbated the situation here and led to needless deaths, needless economic damage, and needless numbers of people who were infected. A ray of hope, I would also point back to September 11th. Norma Netta, a former member of Congress, a member of the cabinet under the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, said that right after the September 11th attack, when President Bush was holding a cabinet meeting, President Bush pointed to Norma Netta in the room and said, we need to make sure that what happened to the Japanese in World War II does not happen to our Muslim American community here in America. And that was showing a sensitivity against stereotyping people and discrimination. And I just wish that this administration would show that same compassion and sensitivity. But that was a ray of hope. That was a ray of hope. And if the administration isn't going to do it, everyone else in America needs to come together, because if we're going to be successful in fighting this virus, reducing the number of people or controlling it, containing it, and hopefully preventing more deaths, we need people to come together in common cause, in common humanity to really attack this.
Powerful words. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you so much, Rep. Santos. We are now going to transition to our next segment. We have now rooted our conversation in history in order to chart a path forward, but we want to deepen that knowledge a bit more. So our next segment will give an overview of some of how our major encounters with racism over time have occurred in our community. And I'd like to invite Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu to introduce it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We know that anti-Asian xenophobia and racism isn't new to this country. In fact, we can trace the historical narratives that braid together the vestiges of Western imperialism with the rise of nativism all the way back to the start of the United States. As colonial trading posts led to the spread of disease and even death, with new populations mixing and coming into contact with different types of disease, this led to fears about quote unquote others, right? Those who are not like us, or in other words, xenophobia. In fledgling United States, this anti-foreigner sentiment resulted in the enactment of a series of anti-alien laws. The Naturalization Act, which put up barriers to citizenship, the Enemy Aliens Act, which authorized the imprisonment and deportation of non-citizens from so-called hostile nations in the late 1700s. By the 19th century, These anti-immigrant attitudes merge with rising racist social theories and increasing immigration from Asia to highlight that the physical and cultural dissimilarities of the Oriental precluded his assimilation into American society and becoming source material for popularized parodies of Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, and other Asian Americans. Now, we know that Asian Pacific Americans are not a monolithic group, yet we do share a common experience of racism. This next segment is intended to give a snapshot of anti-Asian racism experienced by some ethnic groups and is not representative of all of our community's experiences. But we'll hear from diverse voices who will help illuminate how some of our experiences may be connected. So for the leaders that you'll hear from in the next segment, here's the instructions. Imagine that you're briefing a presidential candidate before a big speech about the history of anti-API hate in the United States, and you only have 2 minutes. What experiences would you highlight from your own community?
Okay. Again, good evening. I'm Karen Ishizuka, Chief Curator of the Japanese American National Museum. You know, when some people think about museums, they think museums are only about the past rather than being relevant for the present and the future. But the past can be prologue and history matters, especially today when we are in the midst of yet another cycle of anti-Asian hatred. The history of anti-Japanese hate began in the early 1900s. Unlike Western European immigrants who could become naturalized citizens, Japanese were considered aliens ineligible for citizenship. In addition to intense public hostility, there were legal acts of racism, such as the alien land laws that prohibited Japanese from owning land. Now, this cycle of hate was so widespread, it culminated in a federal law that banned immigration from Japan in 1924. During World War II, although the US was also at war with Italy and Japan and Germany, only Americans of Japanese ancestry were forcibly taken from their homes and incarcerated en masse. On the night of December 7th, 1941, some 7,000 Issei men, including my grandfathers, were picked up and imprisoned. Just 2 months later, 110,000 men, women, children, including my parents, aunts, and uncles who were American citizens by birth, were sent to concentration camps for the duration of the war. And it's paramount to remember that all this happened without due process of law, which thereby endangers everyone's constitutional rights. Yet another cycle of anti-Japanese violence was during the recession of the 1980s, when anything and anyone considered Japanese was literally bashed. Now history is repeating itself again. Xenophobia is again targeting immigrants. Mass incarceration of people based on only who they are is flagrant, and Asian Americans are again being scapegoated. So history does matter, but we can't just remember history, we must learn from it.
Good evening. My name is Rahul Gupta. I'm the Education and Tour Director at the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle, Washington. I did this as if I'm actually speaking to you as a presidential candidate. So I have 2 minutes to brief you on the history of anti-Chinese violence in our city, state, and pretty much the country. Why is this brown Indian American talking about it? Because I myself found my roots in Chinatown International District. So instead of briefing you on specific historic moments, which wouldn't be doing you any service, because as you've heard already, that every experience has led to another. I need you to understand the human impact of racism and violence, the emotional and political in particular. The people you're about to step in front of are not resilient because we or they can take a beating and stand back up. It's because we have grown deep community roots that make it really hard to dislodge us. From the arrival of Chin Chun Hawk on the left, before Seattle was a city, before Washington was a state, through the experience following the anti-Chinese riot here in the city in 1886, the expulsion and the subsequent rebuilding of Chinatown 2, and by some measure, we're now seeing Chinatown 3. Displacement and expulsion are the fallback action, and based on weak excuses, whenever it suits the political winds. The expectation on you is to block that wind. Despite the living history and memory of that day and those lingering embers of hate built into redlining and segregation, families still form bonds with each other. As you can see, an old photo of Mrs. Dong sitting in Canton Alley on a wooden bench, speaking with a friend. Families form bonds, but we also build communities and institutions to protect ourselves. Healthcare, mental health services, domestic violence services, housing. In the end, the heroes they sought way back then and the ones we seek today are our own. Standing in front of the microphone, they will not be looking to you to save them, rather to honor their experience and to work with them in everything they've already built. The violence against the Chinese community was profound and impactful and hateful. Other Asian and Pacific Islander Americans experienced similar paths in that continued history. New group, same fear, same wins. Whether the incarceration of Japanese Americans in the Second World War, which emptied out most of our Chinatown International District, or to the right, the excuse that money outweighs human presence in their neighborhoods. See, before COVID, our Chinatown and other Asian neighborhoods faced years of pressure of displacement under the guise of economic progress. Gentrification is not a benign happenstance. Something to remember. And lastly, broken windows and racist propaganda stickers, because I was asked to put a picture of those stickers and I said no, because I'm not giving that any more airtime. Broken windows and racist propaganda stickers don't scare people for long. Instead, as you see, the youth bring art and beauty and protection to their own neighborhoods, installing murals on these broken windows and telling the people who see it, hey, our roots are too deep. We can't be dislodged. That's what you got to remember as you get up on that stage.
I'm Dorothy, pardon me. I'm Dorothy Cordova, and I'm the founder of the Filipino American National Historical Society. And mine will be brief, but it's going to be historical and probably personal, too. Those of you who are looking at this through Zoom, I guess, because I'm talking on the telephone, I did make sure that there were at least 3 images. One in particular, the headline says, "Mobs Drive Filipinos from Valley Town." It actually was, we're finding out, it was Ku Klux Klan in Yakima, and hundreds of the Filipino men were driven from town. What happened there was part of the problem not only was their presence, but a number of the families there were mixed families. They were white women married to Filipino men. The state of Washington did not have anti-miscegenation laws, so there were most of the kids I grew up with were mestizo. So, and then all through California, or through the Central Valley, there were signs in many hotels, or specifically Stockton, where there were signs that said, positively no Filipinos allowed. And some of the people in the oral histories had told me some signs said positively no Filipinos or dogs allowed. It shows that they, then another image was also from Stockton. It shows a bombing of the Filipino Federation. There were people in that building. No one was killed. But this is all a threat. These are physical threats. that we experienced during the 20s and 30s. There is a more subtle way too. When the Philippines became the first American colony in the Far East, well, probably the only one, they put on exhibit in the cultural zoo people from the mountain tribes and who ate dog. And they portrayed these people as half-civilized, dog-eating creatures who needed to be Christianized. And so as a child, I grew up with these people calling me dog eater, brown monkey. These are some of the images I remember, the calling. It made a lot of us pretty neurotic, but it probably set us up for civil rights when we all of a sudden we felt a voice and we remembered all of these traumatic things that had happened, so we struck out at the system. There were many other different things that growing up in my neighborhood, when my dad moved us into a neighborhood that was basically white in the Madison Valley and was working class, but the kids in the neighborhood were not allowed to play with my brothers and I, which didn't matter to us because we were a large family and we knew that they wanted to play with us because we had more fun. But it took some time for them to do it. These are the things that we grew up with. Those of us, I'm 88, so many different types of experiences of discrimination. I mean, all of a sudden it's coming out. I went to basically a Japanese school. It was run by the Maryknoll Order, and it was only Japanese, 90% Japanese, 10% Filipino. I had to say goodbye to my friends in March of 1942. And I couldn't understand why they were being sent away. All these things just made people like me who were my age really deep down angry. To be called, going to a store to buy something, and people wouldn't wait on you. Being denied entry to, if you even were able to get into a restaurant back in the 30s or 40s, there were insults that were hurled at you. Personal things. So by the time I started doing research with immigrants back in the 70s, I saw different kinds of discrimination. A lot of these people older, but again, it was a double whammy on them. When they were trying to get people to employ them, they looked foreign, and they were foreign, many of them, and they spoke with an accent. So it was those times when we think about it, when I was teaching class, I would tell the students now who think that everything is good, it isn't good. History has a tendency to repeat itself. Maybe we won't get the violent things like the bombings or the mobs driving people out from Valley Town, or signs up there saying, you're not allowed along with another animal, or being called brown monkey. All these different things that really touched me deep down. I've seen in the work that I did with immigrants, I saw men virtually destroyed, dying young, because they came to the United States with high hopes, thinking this is a land of milk and honey, only to realize that it wasn't. And there's a lot of work to do. And the thing I think, basically, as a historian and a former teacher, is there's a lot of work that we have to do to educate people, the young people, not only people who look like us, but people who don't look like us, to let them know that we also are part of the United States and we help this country grow. And this is really what disturbs me, when people don't realize that we are part of the fabric of America and we help build this country. So good luck to all of you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sefa Aina. I'm not sure if my slides were able to get, okay, here we go. Why you should pay attention to Pacific Islanders. I think that as we try to bring a collective voice to our collective issues, that we also be mindful of the margins within our margins, so that we can all be better allies and really make this pan-ethnic term APA as representative as possible. I speak from the Pacific Islander community. I know there are other sort of sub pan-ethnic groups under this larger umbrella that we also should be mindful during these times, and every time that you advocate for Pacific Islanders. Next slide. We're at a very interesting place in our history, and what I would say to everyone on this presentation, as well as potential presidential candidates, is that this recent sort of COVID-19 pandemic has really had a lot of that impacts on our communities. A lot of my friends and colleagues on the line will talk about the actual violence and the scapegoating that has been experienced by many in the Asian American community. I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Pacific Islander community and how we're being affected. In my home state of California, we were notified early on by our allies in public health, or at least I was notified, at least a couple months ago by scholars at UCLA. We saw an alarming number of COVID-19 cases, as well as COVID-19 deaths related to the proportion of us here in the state. At the time we were first beginning to talk about this, NHPI, this is about a month ago, made up around 0.3% of the state's population, but 1.5% of those infected. And the same for the death rate in the state as well. And this was true for other places where you'll find high concentrations of Pacific Islanders, like in the state of Washington, Utah, Arkansas, in Hawaii, and other places again where our communities reside. This was a clarion call for our community as Pacific Islanders to sort of come together. Next slide. And if I can point to one person, at least for me, who helped bring this community together, be Dr. Ray Samoa, the person in this picture, who is a physician at the City of Hope in Los Angeles, and one of maybe 3 Samoan doctors in all of LA County, who himself was also tested positive for COVID-19, and luckily for us, for our whole community, was able to pull through. But as a physician, as a epidemiologist, as someone who has really kind of been at the fore for our community, talking about pretty much comorbidities and things that exacerbate COVID-19. He brought a lot of us together to really speak specifically along the lines of testing, data gathering, resources, community engagement, and things like that. And along with him, next slide, please. He's the co-chair of a committee that we formed called the National PI COVID-19 Response Team. Dr. Nia Ito'oto is a community researcher and who is grounded directly doing work on the ground at this point in both Arkansas as well as Utah. Last slide. This story map is an opportunity, or if you're able to screenshot this, I would ask you all to take some time to keep yourselves up to date on how this has been impacting us. This is my last slide, and what I'll say here is, there's a duality of how we as an AAPI community are seen in this country. We're both hyper visible with this Orientalist views of the Asian communities in particular as the perpetual foreigner, as people who are here taking jobs, taking spots in colleges and universities, against also an invisibility, when it comes to suffering, when it comes to seeing us as people on the margin, as people who are or have been part of this American fabric for over 100 years. What I would say to any candidate pursuing any office is to understand that this virus has exacerbated the inequities that were already existing in our communities. We are impacted because we are essential workers. We live in multi-generational homes. We have high rates of comorbidities, things like diabetes, hypertension, things like that. You will find PIs as well as Asian Americans on all of those cracks of society that are so close to falling through. I would remind you, candidates, that not only do we see the physical violence of being labeled as the problem and as the source of this current pandemic, but we should also see and not lose focus on the violence that our communities face daily, due to poverty, historical trauma, and institutional racism. This is stuff that's been rooted in history. So it's not like we just ended up in this condition in this country. These things were intentional. These things are perpetual. They existed, from the first time Asian Americans or Asians and Pacific Islanders became part of this country. One I guess shining light for me, at least, is the only place in this whole U.S. empire that has not had any cases of COVID-19 is American Samoa. But these are the little things we find hope in. These are little things that send us signals that we're going to be okay. We're going to persevere, like our ancestors that came before us, like the AAPI leaders who've come before us. That we're going to persevere and make it through this. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Hi, my name is Monica Tamrath, and I think in continuing to try to center communities in the margin, I was asked to share the perspective and historical context for the Southeast Asian American community. As a board member of the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, an organization that was founded in 1979 to help resettle hundreds of thousands of refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, refugees like my family. In 1975, very important year in the Southeast Asian American community. After spending 5 years in a refugee camp, my parents and their newborn daughter, my older sister, came to the US and were resettled in Minnesota. Despite government programs to disperse refugees and take them away from possible community support, my parents moved to California to join my family that resettled in San Diego. So I was actually born and raised in Southeast San Diego, a little corner of a big city in a big state alongside mostly Black, Latinx, and other Asian and Pacific Islander working families like Cephas. You all probably have similar little corners like this in your cities, where working class folks of color struggle together to work and raise their families with dignity and respect, despite a lack of investments in public infrastructure, services, and support in vulnerable jobs and places of employment. Other little corners like this are like Stockton, California, where in 1989, a white supremacist openly shot into a schoolyard, killing Southeast Asian elementary school students. You probably hear about our community mostly when folks talk about the model minority stereotype. Oftentimes our community is used as an example to push back on the idea that all Asian Americans achieve economically and educationally. While data disaggregation is important, especially to redirect resources and support, this deficit model narrative could also be harmful. Imagine growing up Laotian American and your community is only brought up when folks talk about how you can't seem to graduate high school and you live in poverty. The Southeast Asian American community has many strengths beyond traditional metrics of success, like our incredibly powerful sense of refugee resilience. My grandma in this photo swam across the Mekong River, lived in a camp, worked in a sweatshop, taught me how to drive, and has a beautiful vegetable garden in her backyard. Those things can't be boiled down into a statistic. We are also positioned to build solidarity with other communities of color, immigrant communities, and working class folks because many of us grew up in the same neighborhoods. While we experience anti-Asian discrimination with our Asian American siblings, there are also experiences we share with other communities too. Southeast Asian Americans don't see state violence, detention and deportation, and racial profiling as some other communities' issue or problem. They are also ours. For Southeast Asian Americans, discrimination is not new to us, but deeply rooted in our history with colonization, war, inadequate resettlement, and being used as a wedge. Our community is proud of our resilience, being in community with others to build, fight back, and struggle for a more equitable and just society for all. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shikha Bhatnagar, and I am the Executive Director of the South Asian Network, also known as SAN. We're one of the oldest South Asian community-based organizations in the United States. The story of anti-South Asian American hate in the US is as old as the history of our immigration into this country. Some of the earliest recorded acts of violence towards our community were at the turn of the 20th century. One of the most notorious being the Bellingham riots in the state of Washington in 1907, when hundreds of Sikh laborers were robbed, attacked, and driven out of town by a large mob of 500 white men. The story of anti-South Asian American hate is all inclusive. No one is safe. We've been attacked for our faith, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, our clothes, our countries of origin. In the late 80s and early 90s, there were a string of attacks against Indian Americans in New Jersey, some of whom were fatally injured or lost their lives. The group called themselves the Dot Busters, a derogatory name for the adornment that Hindu women wear on their foreheads. The story of anti-South Asian American hate and racism is the story of absorbing the hate directed at other communities. Attacked after being mistaken for being Persian during the Iran hostage crisis, attacked and killed for looking Arab after 9/11, and attacked for simply being brown because we so fully encompass the other. South Asian Americans for a century. We are represented in some of the most distinguished professions in this country. The daughter of a South Asian immigrant even ran for president recently. But despite these accomplishments, the hate and racism against our community continues to rise, inflamed most recently by a white supremacist administration. And what this means is that assimilation doesn't mean acceptance. And this model minority myth is exactly that. It's a myth. We remain an other. South Asians are increasingly joining and supporting other Asian Pacific American communities and people of color in fighting against racism and hate. And that's especially crucial at this time in our country because their story is our story. Thank you.
Thank you so much to each one of our presenters. That was incredible. And I know it was a lot of information, but please take a moment to think about how our communities have responded to each of these challenges and how history informs the present. What we've experienced in the past is reflected in what we're seeing in our communities today. So next up, we'll hear from some speakers who will give us additional food for thought about how history has informed where we are today. I'm happy to pass the mic to Yulie Niu, State Assembly member from New York, to introduce our next guest.
Thank you, Michelle. So first off, our next segment is actually going to feature two different scholars, and we have a little activity for them actually. And they have actually looked at Asian American way of life, like our Asian American way of life, and the reality that it actually is shaped by public perception. So this activity is going to be cool. We're going to actually look at a word or phrase that we've seen in media recently. And I just want to kind of put this out there that it might be a very hurtful discussion for some folks, but we want to talk about how it's based in different images and ideas rooted in our history here in the US. And first I wanted to invite Professor Kevin Nadal from John Jay College to speak about the word infected. Kevin, are you there?
Hi, everyone. So greetings, I'm Mabuhay from New York City. I want to start by acknowledging some of the identities that I bring to the table. So first of all, as a Filipino American, as a queer person of color, as a brown Asian American, and then as a New Yorker, these very identities impact the ways that I'm experiencing this entire pandemic. And I think that's really important for us as we have our discussions, not just today, but throughout API Heritage Month, as well as just in our lives in general, because intersectional identities are so important. And as all the previous speakers have talked about, they're very important for those who come from the most marginalized of identities. And so I want to first acknowledge that as a Filipino American with a phenotype that doesn't necessarily match what people perceived as East Asian American or as Asian American, which oftentimes is synonymous with Asian American, I'm not experiencing the types of things that a lot of my East Asian siblings are. So I'm not experiencing the types of COVID-related racism or violence or harassment or microaggressions. And I think that's very important just for me to acknowledge. And I hope what it means for others is to recognize that even if you yourself are not experiencing this type of violence or hate, that it's still very important because it's affecting people in our community. And we have to care about things, not just because they're happening to us. In the same ways that I hope that people care about the anti-South Asian or anti-Muslim hate that happened after 9/11 and still continues today, as well as the anti-Black violence that we see throughout history and in every day of our lives. And so with that, the word that I'm going to reflect on today is infected. And over the past few weeks, there have been numerous instances of violence in which some Asian American person was accused of being infected, and then they became the target of some sort of violence. For me, infected is especially triggering for so many different reasons, and particularly related to my identities. There was a story just last week of a Filipino American in New York nurse who was harassed and physically pushed off of a subway train because he was accused of being infected. He was also called a Chinaman, as well as a Chinese N-word, a fact that only few news reporters mentioned. And this story stuck out to me because it spoke to the multiple ways that Filipino Americans might be affected by this pandemic. I think one thing that's worth noting is that it's not just me and my experience of not necessarily encountering this coronavirus or this COVID-related discrimination, but the recent studies that have been collecting all of this anti-Asian harassment or discrimination finds that only 5% of the 1,500 cases are actually Filipino. So it's not necessarily something that Filipinos experience. However, if you're Filipino American who either is perceived as an East Asian American, or if racists just can't decipher between ethnic groups, that's something that might occur to all of us. And so for Filipinos who read as Asian Americans, to be susceptible to the anti-Asian racism is something that is very much possible, as evidenced with this case. But I really wanted to focus on the piece of him being called a Chinese N-word, because it's so reminiscent of the treatment of Filipinos throughout history. Throughout the history of the United States, Filipinos have been called Asian N-words. The US government called us little brown brothers. And throughout the history, especially on the West Coast of Filipino Americans, we've been called things like brown monkeys, as Auntie Dorothy Cordova mentioned before. During the Watsonville riots of 1930, we were called rapists and viewed as criminals. And so these are still very much different types of stereotypes that are oftentimes aligned with African Americans. And so I appreciate all the other speakers who mentioned the different types of discrimination that Asian Americans might experience. As a queer person of color, the term infected is very triggering for me as well, because it's so reminiscent of the derogatory usage of language towards people both living with and those who have died of HIV/AIDS. And you know who was at the front line of that pandemic pandemic in the 1980s and the 1990s was actually also Filipino nurses who were specifically brought over to this country because many American-born healthcare workers didn't want to work with those that were quote unquote infected. And it makes me realize how hurtful and dehumanizing it is for somebody to not just stereotype you and criminalize you based on how you look, but also for people to do this particularly to healthcare workers, to people who sacrifice their lives every day, people that we view as heroes, people who would be taking care of this perpetrator if he showed up in the emergency room. And so to accuse this young man or to accuse any Asian American as being infected is not just disrespectful, but it's also based in ignorance. Asian Americans are just as likely to carry the COVID-19 as a person of any other race. We know that COVID-19 does not discriminate based on race or religion or sexual orientation or gender identity, and that in New York City alone, 20,000 people have been killed because of this virus. But we also need to recognize that it's not just people in general, that Black and brown people and elders of color and people coming from low-income neighborhoods are dying at disproportionate rates. In other parts of the country, Indigenous people are dying at disproportionate rates. And for me as a New Yorker, and the last identity I bring, for weeks, I've received notifications from friends and students who've told me about their parents that they've lost, their grandparents, their aunts, uncles, cousins, and even someone who lost a child. And for me personally, I had not experienced someone directly who died, with the exception of this past week, when my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jean Lao Chin, a Chinese-American woman born in Brooklyn in 1944, who would later get her doctorate from Columbia University and become a matriarch of Asian American psychology, became infected with COVID-19. Her husband died 2 weeks prior, and she died on Tuesday. One of the last things she wrote was a blog post in March published on Psychology Today, criticizing the current administration's response or lack of response to the crisis. And she ended her post with, "We are in times of crisis. Leadership is more important now. It's time to model our humanity toward all and work together to restore our health and safety." And so with that, I hope that we can model everything that Dr. Chin had encouraged us to do, to be human, to show humanity, to make sure that we are always and constantly fighting for social justice. For us, I hope that particularly means that we continue to advocate for those who are most marginalized in our communities, that we address issues of colorism and homophobia and transphobia and sexism within our community. I hope that we could talk about the underrepresentation and oftentimes invisibility of brown Asians and other historically marginalized groups. And I hope that we can not just end the hatred and end the racism that we experience ourselves, but that we can end the bias that occurs within our community. So thank you very much. Please be well and safe. Appreciate.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And first off, I just want to say I'm so sorry for your loss. And I just want to say also thank you so much for addressing the demonization that happens in so many different communities, and so many of our communities are hurt by these words and the way that they are perpetuating violence. And I hope to be able to follow in the doctor's footsteps and hope that we have leadership and humanity go hand in hand. So thank you so much, Kevin. Next, I'd like to invite Professor Erica Lee of the University of Minnesota to speak about the phrase "back to China."
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's important to read not only this phrase "back to China," but also the note in which it was written. So this is a story that was reported on just a few minutes from where I live here in Minneapolis. In March, a Hmong American family returned to their house in the suburbs to find this sign posted at their door. Quote, "We're watching you," the note said. "Take the Chinese virus back to China. We don't want you here infecting us with your diseases." It was signed, "Your Friendly Neighborhood." It's devastating, but it should not be surprising that in 2020, Asian immigrants and Asian Americans are being told to go back to an Asian country that they have never been to before. Go back has also been, for a long time, the rallying cry of xenophobes and nativists seeking to rid the United States of people that they deem to be dangerous threats. It's an effective way of saying you don't belong here, you're not one of us, get out. In these statements are the implied messages that America is a white man's country and that Americans are white. It's also implied that China is the opposite of the United States and that Chinese and other Asian Americans are not just un-American, but are ultimate foreigners, even forever foreigners. Citizenship status does not matter, nor do the generational roots that one may have in this country. My family's been here since 1852. English is the only language that I speak fluently, but I still get asked, of course, that question, where are you from? This is the way that race, white supremacy, and Orientalism work. In the 19th century, Americans shouted, the Chinese must go. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the first federal immigration law to single out an entire group for exclusion based on race and class. But of course, simply ending new immigration was not good enough. Chinese immigrants were also barred from becoming naturalized citizens, and they were forcibly driven out of towns and cities across the West. By the time that Japanese, Korean, South Asians, and Filipinos started coming to the United States, they were also racialized within an already existing anti-Asian framework, one that lumped all Asians together as Orientals, racially inferior foreigners who could never become American. One by one, these groups were barred from entering the US and also from becoming American citizens too. The conflation of Asian Americans with a dangerous Asia has had, of course, devastating consequences. Many speakers have already talked about what's happened during World War II, when 120,000 Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans were forcibly removed, relocated, and incarcerated. Part of that history that is less known is how close to 2,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese Latin Americans were repatriated to Japan during the war. Variations of go back continue to be America's anti-Asian racial epithet of choice throughout the 20th century. Others have also talked about the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese American who was murdered in Detroit, where many white American auto workers blamed the industry's decline on Japan. It's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work, Ronald Ebens was reported to have yelled at Chin. By the 1980s, newly arrived Southeast Asian refugees entered into a now familiar racial landscape in which all Asians were lumped together as suspect, unwelcomed, and foreign. Fleeing wars in which they fought on the side of US forces, they were told to go back to China. What we see in this hate crime directed at the Mua and Yang family here in Minnesota is a culmination of this history, that it is also happening at a time when our political leaders are unabashedly stoking racism and xenophobia with talk of the Chinese virus and Ask China is no mistake. This is not just a Chinese American or an Asian American issue. Anti-Asian racism is just one expression of how white supremacy works. The 19th century anti-Chinese movement worked hand in hand with settler colonialism that forced indigenous peoples off their land and stripped them of their sovereignty. It worked hand in hand with Jim Crow segregation and lynching. It worked hand in hand with the mass deportation of close to 1 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans during the Great Depression. Today, white supremacy and white nationalism delegitimize all peoples of color, calling into question their rights and their power in the United States. We cannot forget that just last summer, President Trump told Democratic Congressman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Presley, and my own Congresswoman Ilhan Omar to go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came. Anti-Asian xenophobia is just one example of how the pandemic is disproportionately impacting poor African-American, Latinx, Asian American, and Indigenous communities, groups that were already vulnerable to economic inequality, health disparities, and social exclusion. In this time of need, we need to support each other. We're not going to go back, but we will move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. And I just wanted to say that this was a really, really good rundown of how the perpetual foreigner syndrome works. And I just wanted to also say thank you because, you know, even in my election, you know, in Lower Manhattan, in the Lower East Side, I was told to go back to where I come from. So thank you so much for running down this incredible knowledge for us. Now I'd like to pass the mic to David Chu, State Assembly member from California, to introduce a special interactive exercise for everyone.
Great, thanks, Yuleen. Hello, everyone. I'm David Chu. I'm zooming in from San Francisco. We're going to have a moment for audience participation. So our community is so diverse that we know that there are a lot of histories that we unfortunately weren't able to cover in this session. So we want to take a moment right now to ask you to reflect on your own unique history, your family history, how that brought you to where you are today, how that shapes the lens that you look out onto these issues and what's going on. So if you were able to join us last week, if you can try to find whatever piece of paper or computer document or wherever you took notes on your phone for this moment of reflection, so we can build off what we learned last week. If you weren't with us last week and this is your first week tuning in, no worries whatsoever. Grab something to write on or open up a document or a note on your device to jot down your reflections. So I'm going to give you just a second to do that. And so now this is what I'm going to ask you to think about. Think about your own family's history in America, whether that extends back for centuries, for decades, for years, or even months. I want you to think about a word or a phrase that describes your American history. Now, there are no wrong answers, none at all. Just jot it down on this piece of paper. And you're going to want to look back at it at the end of the month. So what we would like you to do is to hear from you on what you wrote as your phrase. And if you're open to sharing, we want you to send it to us. And what we're going to do with all of these phrases or these words is we're going to create a word cloud of responses in a few minutes. So hopefully, whatever that word is that you're thinking of, text it to RISE APA. So I'm sorry, text RISE APA to 22333 to join our poll. And then just literally text your word or phrase to 22333. So we're using a text in poll function. It's not a poll on Zoom. So please just pull out your phone, text RISE APA to 22333. And once you've done that, text whatever the word or phrase that you're thinking about to describe your family's history to 22333. All right, hopefully everyone understands that. And while you're thinking, I would like to introduce a special performer to give us a positive way of closing the session and to help us with reflection and to set us up to looking to the future, which is going to be next week and the week after. Please welcome to our virtual stage, singer, songwriter, actress, and YouTuber, Jane Louie.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take these off. My name is Jane, and my music project name is called Soraya, and it is such an honor to be contributing to this important conversation the best way that I know how. I'm certainly not a scholar like so many are here today. It is certainly a strange moment in time, and the thing is, though, that when it gets dark, a glimmer can seem really bright and even show the way. And I think, like every panelist and participant here today, we are being that light for each other. And that is my hope to send you off with for our future. This song is called Firefly. Is it safe in here? I think I need fire. With a man whose eyes are warriors, 1,000 men whose hands fell in the summer. Now the cold stabs him like a thorn. It's no more than cold, dear. The winter sun's never quite warm enough, so let me. It's no more than snow, dear. You're holding me ransom, so why don't you fight me? Oh, those fireflies will light the way this night. So to see all that push dragging you. Keep your curtains closed, I'll tap in your temples. And I'll know you're fine, finding your sorrows. Cause it's true, true. Takes time to become the one you never knew. No, it's no more than fright, dear. It's all the same when you got something to lose here. It's no more than pain, and has it ever been easy to find our way to safety? Oh, those fireflies will light the way this night. So to see all that pushing, dragging you. To push and dragging you.
Oh my gosh. Jane, thank you so much. Audience, Jane Louie, you can find her music on Spotify and YouTube. That was beautiful. And what a way for us to end a wonderful evening together. We do hope that the information that we presented here today brings all of us a greater sense of solidarity, both in the hurt, but also in our strength in one another. Earlier, we asked you to text a word that describes your family's history, and now we'd like to show you the results of that in a word cloud. And as you can see, what a beautiful photograph of the words that come to mind of our families, of our community's history. We are resilient. We are immigrant. We persevere. And above all, we will rise together as APAs. And so we're going to ask that you continue this conversation on social media. Tell us about your family, your community's history, and make sure that you tag us with hashtag RiseAPA. Now that we are at the halfway mark of our series, we also hope that you'll take a moment to tell us what you think about the series and give us feedback about what you'd like to see in the next town hall meetings that will be forward-looking. You can email us at riseapaorg@gmail.com. Thank you once more for joining us tonight. It is during times of crisis like the one that we are in right now, that we join together collectively to hit pause, to grapple together with our challenges, but remember our roots before we start moving forward on a plan of action. So next week, we will explore the future for Asian Pacific America, and we hope you'll join us. Good night.